We're looking at a story at werewolves.com. And it's entitled The Dog-Headed St. Christopher. And it begins, "That's right, boys and girls. Today you're taking a peek at the world of Christianity. I will be covering St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, due to the fact that in medieval descriptions of him, he usually has the head of a dog. According to ancient legend, Christopher was one of a dog-headed race that is sometimes called the Marmaraite, supposedly from a country known as Marmarica, somewhere in North Africa. It's said that when he was young, Christopher was a cannibal and spoke only in the harsh cultural language of the dog-headed race. After hearing the words of a Christian prophet who was preaching on the borders of his homeland, Christopher began to rethink his own life. While he was thinking, an angel appeared and touched his mouth, allowing him to speak in languages that all men could understand. After this, Christopher left his home and traveled to Greece to preach the Christian gospel, becoming quite the missionary in many lands. Yet in spite of this, he still remained a dog-headed man, and the church was ever suspicious of him. The story of Christopher as a doghead lasted long into the medieval period, especially in Ireland. The revered Labar Brack, or the Speckled Book, contains an 8th century Irish calendar of saints, clearly stating that Christopher was a member of the dog-headed race. He ate human flesh and only knew the dog-headed language when he first meditated upon God. A writer known as Walter of Speyer has written 2 biographies on the saint, which also say that Christopher came from a race of dog-headed creatures. Christopher is still considered a problematic saint with pagan connections. In other versions of the story, he is completely human but also a giant, a member of an ancient race that once walked the earth. In this form, he bears the young Christ upon his shoulders across the raging water. Then you have others who don't even consider him a saint at all, in spite of his name being mentioned many times in the English Middle Ages. Even though many believe in St. Christopher, he is not officially recognized by the Vatican. Written by Moonlight. And here at medievalists.net, we have a story by Danielle Cebulski called Werewolves and the Dog-Headed Saint in the Middle Ages. And Danielle begins, "Whether or not the hordes of preteens who read or watched the Twilight Saga series know it, Team Jacob has a very long history. Stories of werewolves and their canine kin have been around for centuries, and some of them may be a bit surprising. In the 12th century, Marie de France wrote a collection of lays or stories of Breton origin, many of which had supernatural elements to them. One of my favorite stories is Bis Clarivet, the story of a nobleman who also happens to be a werewolf. As preface to the story, Marie notes that there are many other stories of werewolves, so tales of these creatures were apparently not uncommon. Unfortunately for Bliss Clavrette, his wife tricks him into revealing his secret, and she uses it against him, stranding him in wolf form. She does get her just desserts in the end, when her wolf of a husband bites off her nose. You can read this fun story as well as Marie's other lays in a place called The Lay of the Werewolf at the link above. The author continues, dog-headed men, or cynocephali, were long thought to be residents of the little explored regions of the world. And you can find references to them both in encyclopedic texts as well as travel literature. Yes, medieval people did write quite a lot of travel literature. Even the famous Marco Polo mentions them, going so far as to place them in the Andaman Islands. Everyone agreed that cynocephali were savage and cannibalistic, not the type of creature you'd like your preteen to fall for. Perhaps the idea of widespread belief in cynocephali is not so far-fetched when one considers the prevalence of imagery in Egypt featuring Anubis, the god of the dead with the head of a jackal. Perhaps traders' experiences in Egypt help to spread this idea. What makes it really interesting, though, is when cynocephali step over into Christianity. When thinking about St. Christopher, the image that immediately springs to mind is that of an old man with a boy on his shoulders. St. Christopher the Christ-bearer. But before he was ever that icon, he was the cynocephalus. In the first few centuries A.D., the legend of St. Christopher told of a dog-headed man who converted to Christianity, leaving behind his animal nature, gaining speech, and seeking to convert others. He is, of course, martyred for his beliefs, after doing his best to convert everyone with whom he comes in contact. Despite being a dog-headed man, St. Christopher was a very respectable saint, and is welcomed into heaven at the end of his life. You can read translations of the St. Christopher story, translated from Latin or Old Irish. The author continues, what is fascinating to me is that, despite the consensus that cynocephali and werewolves were vicious and to be feared, in both Bisclavret and in the legends of St. Christopher, these wolfmen are the heroes in both stories. It is their persecutors who are very clearly in the wrong. You can get lost for hours Googling St. Christopher and cynocephali, and I'm sure there are even more websites that cover the new incarnation of werewolves as handsome, muscle-bound Native Americans, thanks to Twilight. Never saw the Twilight series, the movie series. While I could leave you with one of these images, I think I'll go on with one of St. Christopher, the original Team Jacob mascot. I guess that's a Twilight reference. And what are these links here? Well, here's some, let's go to the translations of the stories. Let's follow this link. Not found. Then let's look under the Wayback Machine. That's YouTube Tools, Research at the top. Punch in the URL. And we got success here. Let's go to 2016. And see one from May 21st of that year. There we go. Origin of the cult. According to the earliest Greek and Latin accounts of St. Christopher, he was a soldier who was martyred for his faith at Antioch in Syria. Unfortunately, the majority of modern reference works ignore these early accounts in favor of the more fantastic medieval accounts in Latin, which culminated in the description of St. Christopher as the giant who carried Jesus across a river on his shoulders. The Latin account of St. Christopher suffered tremendous evolution from a very early date, and the beginnings of very many of the misunderstandings which were to force this evolution can be found even in our earliest surviving accounts of his martyrdom.